High on Mount Everest, above 26,000 feet, the mountain stops feeling like a place and starts feeling like a verdict. Up there, time slows, judgment dulls, and the body quietly begins to shut itself down. Climbers call it the death zone not as a metaphor, but as a warning written in physiology. And yet, year after year, people keep going back, not because they misunderstand the risk, but because they believe they will be the exception. On the surface, Everest appears conquered. Fixed ropes line the route, weather forecasts arrive by satellite. Oxygen bottles are staged in advance. Too many watching from below, the danger feels controlled, even predictable. But the mountain has not changed. What has changed is human behavior. This is not a story about storms alone or avalanches or thin air. This is a story about decisions, quiet, rational-seeming decisions made while exhausted, hypoxic, and emotionally invested. Decisions to climb alone. Decisions to ignore a turnaround time. Decisions to trust equipment that should have been checked twice. Decisions to keep going, just a little longer. Everest does not usually kill climbers suddenly. It wears them down. It lets small mistakes stack on top of one another until there is no margin left. One late summit, one empty oxygen bottle, one moment of confusion, one night spent standing still when movement was the only option. In this story, we'll follow several climbers across different years, experienced guides, first-time aspirants, idealists chasing purity, and clients chasing lifelong dreams. Their paths never crossed, yet their outcomes rhyme in unsettling ways. If you watch K2 stories, you already know this pattern. The mountain does not need villains. It only needs time, altitude, and a human mind that refuses to turn around. This is why Everest keeps killing climbers, and why it will continue to do so long after the summit photos fade. In the spring of 2006, David Sharp arrived on Everest with a plan that, on paper, looked simple. He would climb alone, he would avoid the crowds, and he would attempt the summit without supplemental oxygen. None of these ideas were new. What made them dangerous was not the ambition but the context in which they were pursued. David was not reckless by reputation. He was an experienced mountaineer, drawn to what climbers call a true alpine style. Light gear, minimal support, personal responsibility. He had climbed technical peaks across Europe and Africa. Everest for him was not a box to check. It was something to be experienced on its own terms. But Everest remembers those who return. David had already failed twice. Frostbite ended one attempt, timing ended another. By his third expedition, the mountain had become less a challenge and more a conversation he felt compelled to finish. Those close to him later described a shift not in skill, but in focus. The summit was no longer a possibility, it was a necessity. By mid-May, David began his summit push. He carried 2 small emergency oxygen bottles not as a plan, but as insurance. Above 26,000 feet, that distinction matters. In the death zone, oxygen is not a convenience, it is time itself. Climbers spotted him moving upward late in the day, alone, quiet, determined. What happened next has never been fully reconstructed. Whether David reached the summit remains unknown. What is known is that by the following day, he was descending in a severely hypoxic state. His emergency oxygen was gone, his judgment was compromised. His movements slowed to something closer to instinct than intention. At some point he collapsed inside a shallow limestone alcove known as Green Boots Cave, a place already associated with death. The cave offered shelter from the wind, but not from the cold, and certainly not from the altitude. Dozens of climbers passed him. Some believed he was already dead. Others were low on oxygen themselves. A few stopped briefly, unsure what could be done. At that altitude, helping someone is not a moral decision, it is a physical calculation. Every minute spent standing still increases the odds that 2 people will die instead of 1. David survived the night, barely. The next day, a small group of climbers found him still alive but beyond meaningful rescue. His oxygen saturation was critically low. His hands and feet were frostbitten, speech was difficult, movement nearly impossible. He died there on May 15, 2006. The debate that followed was fierce. Should someone have helped him? Should commercial expeditions be obligated to intervene? Or was David's fate sealed long before anyone walked past that cave? The uncomfortable truth is this: David Sharp did not die because Everest is cruel. He died because Everest is indifferent and because obsession slowly narrowed his margin for error to zero. And he would not be the last climber to learn that lesson the hard way. 6 years later, Everest claimed another life, but this time, the mistake was not obsession with purity. It was something far more common. In 2012, Shreya Shellerine arrived at Everest Base Camp carrying a dream she had held since childhood. As a 9-year-old, she had once seen the mountain from a helicopter. From that moment on, Everest became a promise she made to herself, a promise that waited patiently through marriage, career, and decades of ordinary life. Unlike David Sharp, Shreya was not chasing an alpine ideal. She was chasing completion. The problem was experience. Shreya had never climbed a major peak. Her preparation consisted of endurance training, indoor climbing, and determination. On lower mountains, that might have been enough. On Everest, it was a liability. Acclimatization is not about fitness alone, it is about how the body reacts to altitude stress. Day after day, failure after failure. Sherpas noticed early her pace was slow, her recovery was inconsistent. One refused to take her beyond base camp. It was a warning, not a rejection. She continued anyway. On summit day, the same pattern repeated. Oxygen levels dropped faster than expected. Guides urged her to turn back. She refused. Hours passed. Bottles emptied. Eventually, she reached the summit after more than 20 hours of continuous climbing. By then, the real danger had only begun. The descent is where Everest kills most climbers. Muscles are exhausted, focus is gone. Oxygen margins are thinner than planned. Small delays become critical. Shreya used more oxygen than expected. Flow rates were higher, bottles ran dry. Somewhere high on the mountain, in the death zone, her last oxygen supply ended. Witnesses later described her panic, not dramatic, not loud but visible. Breathing became labored, her heart raced. Then she collapsed into the snow. Her Sherpas tried everything they could. They had no oxygen to spare. Staying longer meant dying alongside her. Her final words were simple: "Save me." There was nothing left to give. Shreya died on the descent, not because she failed to reach the summit, but because she underestimated the cost of leaving it. That same season, 10 other climbers died. For on the same day, Everest does not discriminate between first-timers and veterans, but it punishes inexperience brutally, especially when ambition overrides warning signs. This pattern appears again and again in high-altitude disasters. Not a lack of courage, not even a lack of preparation, but a misunderstanding of where the danger truly lies. The summit feels like the finish line. On Everest, it is only the halfway point. And sometimes, reaching it means you've already stayed too long. In May of 1996, Everest did not need inexperience to turn deadly. It needed something far subtler. It needed one rule to be broken. Rob Hall was not supposed to die on Everest. If there was a guide built for that mountain, it was him. He had summited Everest 5 times. He co-founded Adventure Consultants. His reputation was built on patience, structure, and conservative decision-making. Clients trusted him because he was known to turn people around, no matter how close they were. One rule defined his approach more than any other: the 2 p.m. turnaround time. On Everest, weather patterns are predictable in one critical way. Storms tend to build in the afternoon. Darkness arrives quickly, and once the sun sets, the temperature drop is severe. The turnaround time exists to protect climbers from descending in those conditions. On May 10, 1996, that rule bent. The mountain was crowded, bottlenecks slowed progress. Fixed ropes were delayed, clients were exhausted. Some had already failed the year before and could not face turning back again. Doug Hansen was one of them. A year earlier, he had been forced to turn around just a few hundred meters from the summit. This time, he was not willing to repeat that experience. Rob knew this. He also knew Doug was struggling. By early afternoon, the summit was still above them. They continued. Rob reached the top around 2:30 p.m. Doug arrived nearly an hour later. By then, they were dangerously behind schedule. But turning around after summiting is psychologically harder than pressing on toward it. As they began their descent, the weather changed with terrifying speed. A violent blizzard engulfed the upper mountain. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Fixed ropes disappeared beneath snow. Temperatures plunged to nearly -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Doug collapsed near the south summit. His oxygen was low. His strength was gone. Other climbers radioed Rob, urging him to descend and save himself. He refused. Rob stayed with his client, knowing exactly what that decision might cost him. By morning, Doug was dead. Another guide sent to help never returned. Rob, frostbitten and running out of oxygen, was trapped above the storm. From high on the mountain, with frozen hands, he made a satellite phone call to his pregnant wife in New Zealand. His voice was calm, reassuring, almost detached. "Sleep well, my sweetheart. Please don't worry too much." Those were his final words. 4 climbers from his expedition died. 8 climbers died that day across the mountain. The tragedy was later dissected in books, interviews, and documentaries, whether crowd control, commercialization, leadership, but at the center of it all was a single decision, the decision not to turn around. Rob Hall did not lack experience. He did not lack caution. He did not lack respect for the mountain. What he lacked, in that moment, was time. Everest rarely punishes recklessness immediately. It waits for responsibility, compassion, or ambition to overstay its welcome, and then it closes the door behind you. Sometimes, Everest doesn't kill through exhaustion or storms or delayed decisions. Sometimes, it kills through silence. In 1999, Michael Matthews stood on the summit of Everest at just 22 years old. He had climbed Kilimanjaro. He had experience in the Alps. He was strong, ambitious, and well-funded. On paper, he was prepared. He had oxygen. He had weather windows. And then, somewhere on the descent, he vanished. Michael was climbing with guide Mike Smith along the southeast ridge. The ascent had already been slow. He reached the Hillary Step around 2 p.m. late, but not unheard of. Like many before him, he pushed on anyway, hoping to make history as the youngest British man to summit Everest. He succeeded. 3 hours later, during the descent, a sudden blizzard swept across the mountain. Visibility collapsed. Mike moved ahead to the balcony to change his oxygen bottle, expecting Michael to follow moments later. He never did. Radio calls went unanswered. Searches were ruled too dangerous. The storm did not allow for hesitation. Mike was forced to descend alone. Michael Matthews was never seen again. Months later, unsettling questions surfaced. Other climbers from the same season reported oxygen system failures, bottles that required adapters, valves that leaked, cylinders that delivered inconsistent flow. Michael's family later alleged that promised high-grade oxygen equipment had been substituted with incompatible systems. If oxygen fails in the death zone, there is no gradual decline. There is only confusion, loss of coordination, and collapse. A similar incident nearly killed American physician Robin Moore in 2017. Her oxygen appeared functional until it wasn't. Only a rapid cylinder change saved her life. Up high, equipment failure doesn't announce itself loudly. There is no alarm, no clear warning, just a growing sense that breathing is harder than it should be. By the time climbers realize something is wrong, they may already be incapable of fixing it. But Everest's deadliest mistake isn't always mechanical. In 1998, Frances Arsentive attempted something few had dared, summiting Everest without supplemental oxygen. It was a deeply personal goal, one she had trained for relentlessly. Her husband, an accomplished Russian climber, accompanied her. They summited late, too late. On the descent, weather worsened. They became separated. Frances was found alive but helpless, sitting in the snow, barely conscious. Multiple climbers tried to help her. They failed. Oxygen ran low. Strength disappeared. They were forced to leave her behind. She survived another night. Then another team found her still alive. They tried again. She died shortly after. Her husband went back up to find her. He never returned. Frances's body remained on the mountain for years, earning a haunting nickname among climbers, Sleeping Beauty. Her mistake wasn't courage, it wasn't commitment. It wasn't even the oxygen-free ascent itself, it was time. Late summits, delayed descent, extended exposure in the death zone. On Everest, every extra minute above 26,000 feet is borrowed, and the mountain always collects its debt. By 2019, Everest no longer looked like a remote frontier. It looked crowded. That year, a single photograph taken near the summit spread across the world. A long, unmoving line of climbers clipped to a single rope, waiting their turn to stand on the top of the planet. The image shocked people, but to those who understood Everest, it was not surprising. Overcrowding had turned time into a weapon. Climbers carry a finite supply of oxygen. Most plan for a narrow window, up, down, and out. But queues change everything. 2 hours of waiting in the death zone can mean the difference between a safe descent and an empty bottle. That same week, multiple climbers collapsed after running out of oxygen while standing still. Some never made it down. The problem wasn't ambition alone. It was summit fever, a psychological state well known in high-altitude climbing. After years of training, immense costs, and weeks on the mountain, turning back feels impossible. The summit becomes a magnet. Logic fades. Warnings feel negotiable. Climbers push on with injuries. They ignore weather forecasts. They convince themselves that conditions will hold just a little longer. In 1996, it was a storm ignored. In 2006, it was oxygen underestimated. In 2012, it was the descent dismissed. In 2019, it was time itself. Everest doesn't need new ways to kill climbers. The old ones still work. Thin air dulls the brain. Cold slows the body. Exhaustion narrows perception. One small mistake made at sea level might be corrected. Made above 26,000 feet, it becomes irreversible. Every person who steps onto Everest believes they will manage risk better than those before them. That belief is not arrogance. It is necessary. Without it, no one would go. But the mountain does not care why you climbed. It does not care how much you prepared. It does not care how close you are. The real skill on Everest is not reaching the summit. It is knowing when to turn back. If stories like these matter to you, stories of decision, consequence, and survival at the limits of human endurance, this is what we do on K2 Stories. We don't chase spectacle. We study the moments that change outcomes, because on the world's highest mountains, the difference between life and death is rarely dramatic. It's usually quiet.